Once the temperature forecast dropped below 100 degrees, I started across the western half of the Great Plains. My first leg was due north from Sidney to Bridgeport, Nebraska, near where the trail met the North Platte River. In Pony Express days, this part of the route was known as 30-mile stretch, which denoted the 30 waterless miles between Pole Creek and Mud Springs Station. The distance proved too far for horses pulling stagecoaches, so in July 1861, the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express, which was running stagecoaches as well as the Pony Express, added deep wells stationed in between. Despite the name, no one found water here no matter how deep they dug. The company had to freight water in from the stations on either end of this dry section of the trail. Mid-morning, I reached the microdot town of Gurley, Nebraska. I stopped in at Outlaw's Cafe, a diner as small as the town, and for $2 I got a great cup of coffee and the tastiest homemade donut I've ever eaten. I'm sure it was deep fried and something banned in California since the 70s, but it was an epic donut. The town of Dalton sat a little further up the highway. It has a prairie scooter museum, but it wasn't open, so I passed along. Later that morning, I detoured to the site of Mud Springs Station. Water would have been trucked from here back to Deep Well Station. The Mud Springs Monument sat in the most isolated spot of any station site I'd seen to that point. There were horses and cattle wandering through the area, but they didn't seem to mind my presence. From there, I rode more dusty miles to the main attraction for the day, Courthouse and Jail Rocks. These were the first of the great natural landmarks of the Emigrant Trail. It was easy to see how these formations must have impressed overlanders, who traveled for weeks across the relatively monotonous prairie and plains. They found the monuments intriguing. According to Merrill Mattis, travelers became more and more fascinated, to the point they felt magnetically drawn to the rock itself. A great number of emigrants crossed open country to climb Courthouse Rock, and of course carve their names. I took one of the benches near the base of the rocks to enjoy the quiet and the chance to contemplate the monuments while I had a snack and caught my breath from the climb. There were GPS coordinates for a Pony Express station site nearby, but no monument, at least as far as I could find. It was a quick 5 or 6 miles from Courthouse Rock to my destination in Bridgeport, Nebraska. The town sits on the North Platte River, near where the older branch of the Oregon and California trails reunited with the newer route after separating across the South Platte in 2 different places. The old California crossing near Brule, Nebraska, and after 1859, the new California crossing near Julesburg, Colorado. I enjoyed my afternoon in Bridgeport. I had a nice tour of the Pioneer Trails Museum, which sits just across the North Platte River from downtown, then spent a couple of hours in a bakery called Call Me Cupcake. Who could resist an invitation like that? The piped-in music was some streaming service playing early 70s easy listening. It was peaceful. More than that, I found it somehow rejuvenating. Maybe it was just a sugar rush, but for the first time in my ride, I felt comfortable, like I belonged, that what I was doing was okay, and even more, that it wasn't crazy to want to bike pack the Pony Express Trail, that maybe I hadn't taken on something I had no business attempting. The next day, I made it to Chimney Rock, the most popular landmark of the entire Emigrant Trail. More immigrants noted it in their diaries than any other. They thought it was the ultimate in natural curiosities, the zenith of sightseeing goals, the 8th wonder of the world. It has been described prosaically as an inverted funnel. Immigrants likened it to exotic images such as towering clouds, necks of ostriches, and mosque minarets. The local Native Americans called it elk penis. According to historian Irene Padden, it is also a cenotaph, nature's own monument to the graves of immigrants buried nearby who died during the cholera epidemics of 1849 and 1850. From Chimney Rock, I rode through Gering, Nebraska, and on to Scottsbluff, my stop for the night. This was the biggest city I'd seen since Kearney. Riding in town was stressful. The streets were 4-lane, no shoulder, curb-to-curb roadway. Apparently no one in Scottsbluff had heard that bikes share the road with cars. The sidewalks weren't even that bike-friendly. Instead of leaving the next morning, I took a day to circumnavigate Scottsbluff National Monument. Scottsbluff was named for a hapless trader who fell ill near the Laramie River, was abandoned by his compatriots, and crawled 50 miles before dying in this area, where his remains were found the following year, though the part about the 50-mile crawl may be an exaggeration. A multi-use trail in town connected with the National Park Trail, so I got to enjoy riding halfway around the bluffs without having to worry about cars. Like Courthouse Rock and Chimney Rock, overlanders climbed all over themselves to find more expressive ways to convey the grandeur of Scottsbluff. According to historian John Unruh, to the overlanders, the West was larger than life, and consequently, they tended to describe the landscape in superlatives. The scenery was the grandest they had ever seen, the trees the tallest, the natural roads the finest, the water the best, the grass the most luxuriant. The list is as endless as there were phenomena to describe. In immigrant days, the North Platte River washed against the base of the bluffs, so immigrants had to leave the river and continue west from the present town of Gering, Nebraska. The immigrant trail didn't cross northwest through Scotts Bluff until Mitchell Pass was cut in 1850. Though the Pony Express Trail ran through Mitchell Pass, the Pony Express bikepacking route follows the original trail from Gering through Rubidoux Pass. The day I left Scotts Bluff, the wind forecast was for 15 miles per hour out of the north. Stiff, but not too bad. But one thing I'd learned about Nebraska was that it had a sense of humor. This extended to weather forecasts, where the predicted wind speed was the absolute minimum it would blow. There was also a 100% chance of rain that evening, all of which said to me, ride short, get a room. Just like back in Lexington, Nebraska, I decided to forego the gravel zigzag Pony Express route and take the highway, which angled into the headwind. Not far west of Morrill, Nebraska, I came to a pullout with interpretive signs commemorating the Great Smoke. This was a treaty council in 1851 between the U.S. government and most of the Native American tribes along the Emigrant Trail. The council took place in September 1851. The U.S. government wanted to ensure safe passage along the Emigrant Trail, to secure the right to build forts on Native American land, and to encourage peaceful settlement of disputes between tribes as well as between immigrants and Native Americans. Native Americans wanted compensation for the ravages of the overlanders, including the vanishing game and the depleted forage along the trail. The result was the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, also known as the Horse Creek Treaty, a flawed but good faith attempt to negotiate a peace rather than go to war. Almost as soon as the treaty was signed, however, the Lakota violated its terms by invading the hunting grounds of the Crows. The U.S. Army, in turn, violated the treaty 3 years later, when Lieutenant Grattan was allowed to attack a Lakota encampment awaiting distribution of treaty annuities, an event memorialized a little further along the road. A few miles on, the town of Henry, Nebraska leaned against the eastern border of Wyoming. I crossed through town, then entered my fifth state since I left St. Joseph some 750 miles back. By this point, the wind was better than 20 miles per hour, with gusts over 30. Fortunately, it wasn't many more miles until I reached my stop for the night, Torrington, Wyoming. I had a room booked due to the rain forecast, but I swung by Pioneer Park just to see what the camping options were. Looking at the primitive campground, dozens of yards from water and restrooms, I had an epiphany, a flash of insight, such as we who are gifted with the profound lack of self-knowledge receive from time to time. It came to me in this moment of clarity that as nice as they were, I didn't really like camping in city parks. And what's more, that I didn't have to camp at all, at least as far as Casper, Wyoming. I could stay in motels, and there was no reason not to. Foregoing campgrounds to stay in motels was not true bikepacking, of course. Yeah, maybe I was wimping out. But even Pony Express riders, those dauntless centaurs of Western lore, had a roof and a meal waiting for them at the end of every ride. The next morning, I came across a monument commemorating the short battle known as the Grattan Massacre, or the Grattan Fight, depending on one's point of view. This was the incident where the U.S. Army violated the Fort Laramie Treaty. The short version is that bands of Lakota were gathering near Fort Laramie to await distribution of gifts under the terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty. A lame cow belonging to a Mormon immigrant strayed and was killed and slaughtered by High Forehead, a Miniconjou. The immigrant complained to the Army officers of Fort Laramie. Chief Conquering Bear went to the fort and offered the Mormon to pick up any horse from his herd for compensation. The Mormon refused. Under the Fort Laramie Treaty, the Indian agent was responsible for settling disputes between immigrants and Native Americans, but he was still a few days' travel away. John Grattan, a 24-year-old lieutenant itching to fight the Lakota, demanded permission to lead a detail to arrest High Forehead. The fort commander relented. When High Forehead failed to surrender, Grattan's command fired a volley into the Lakota village, wounding one man. When that attempt failed, he fired a second volley, fatally wounding Conquering Bear. The Lakota warriors then counterattacked and killed every man in Grattan's detail. Battles between the U.S. Army and Native Americans often have multiple names, depending on who's writing the history. Massacre is defined as savage and indiscriminate killing, and is used commonly in reference to those not in a condition to defend themselves. Grattan Massacre hardly seems fitting in this case, when a fully armed detail lost the fight they'd started, but there are no other monuments nearby to tell that side of the story. I had had a relatively easy ride from the Grattan Monument to the town of Fort Laramie. I stopped by the Fort Laramie National Historic Site to have lunch and spend a little time soaking in the history. The name Laramie dates from 1818, when a trapper named Jacques Laramie built a cabin and, courtesy of the locals, left his bones to bleach at the confluence of the North Platte and Laramie rivers. Subsequent traders built trading posts in the area. In 1849, the U.S. government bought a cluster of adobe buildings from the American Fur Company to turn the post into a military base to protect and support overland immigrants. When the government purchased the fort, however, it only acquired title to the buildings. Native Americans owned the land. Obtaining clear title was one of the reasons for the Great Smoke, the treaty council that led to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Fort Laramie represented many things to overlanders. Like Fort Kearny, it was a remote outpost of civilization, the last island holding any semblance of life back in the States. It was the last place until Fort Bridger, 400 miles west, where immigrants could lay over, buy supplies, and have repairs made. Fort Laramie sat about one-third of the way between St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento, California, and passing this point was akin to crossing the equator on an ocean voyage. Seeing the elephant was an idiom for the difficulties of the overland journey. Making it to Fort Laramie entitled an overlander to spit in the elephant's eye. There were troubles ahead, but by then immigrants were inured to the difficulties of overland travel. Fort Laramie marked the end of the plains. From there to Casper, the trail skirted the Laramie Mountains, known as the Black Hills in immigrant times. From here, the climbs would get steeper, the headwinds stronger, and the ride harder than anything behind me.